My name's Mark Doran. I am part of these four organizations listed on the bottom of the page here. I've been asked to, with others, give a short course, a seminar with the title Alberta's Orphan Well Crisis. I'm going to do so tomorrow in Calgary, but I thought I'd do a dry run through and make a video, possibly post it on my YouTube channel, because this is one of the greatest financial challenges facing the province of Alberta today in early December 2025. So before we get into it, I'd just like to clarify that Alberta doesn't really have an orphan well crisis yet, but it's coming. What we have is a terminology issue. There's conflation of the terms orphan with the term abandoned. Some people think abandoned wells means walking away from the wells, which is what creating an orphan really is. So we've got a bit of a terminology problem, and I'll deal with that as we go. The real problem we have in Alberta is that we have something called orphan fund legislation, and it's not being followed. That's what I'm going to spend most of my time on in my short course presentation. My presentation will be in three parts. The first part will be orphan fund legislation. We have laws governing this thing called the orphan fund, which I'm going to spend most of my time on. Part two, I'm going to not spend it nearly as much time on. I'm going to talk about something called liability management policies that are made by the government and the Alberta Energy Regulator. That's the sole regulator in Alberta that's in charge of upstream oil and gas. And I'm going to just do a brief summary of that. Uh, the Alberta Energy Regulator, if it doesn't administer this legislation properly, it can create a lot of extra costs for landowners who can recover their costs through applying to the Land and Property Rights Tribunal. We're going to spend a little bit of time on that. So, uh, where the Alberta Energy Regulator, where it fails to manage this orphan well problem they're having, this can actually cost taxpayers a lot of money in ways that they don't seem to be aware of and that aren't that obvious. So we are going to deal with that. And then part three, I'm going to talk about true polluter pay. How can we lobby for changes in legislation to solve part of this problem where the Land and Property Rights Tribunal orders the province to pay landowners on behalf of defunct oil companies and other problems. So those are the three parts to my presentation today that I'm going to be covering. So the first part one is the legislated orphan fund. Let's get into it. I'm going to break this down into several subparts, this topic about the legislated orphan fund. So first of all, what is the orphan fund? That's part A. I submit that the orphan fund is really the envy of the world and that we must, as Albertans, protect it. Other oil and gas jurisdictions just don't have this approach. I submit that our approach is far superior than any other jurisdiction's approach. And this fund is unique. It is supposed to protect citizens from what we're going to talk about called closure costs when oil and gas companies go bankrupt under federal bankruptcy laws, or if they otherwise abscond, leave the province, etc. So this orphan fund, I'm going to sort of paint two pictures, if you will. I got a little help from artificial intelligence here. I think of it as a safety net. I suggest that this one way citizens can think of it. So the Alberta Energy Regulator has this liability management program that we're going to talk about in part two. And if they fail to manage these liabilities, if they fail to make the correct person pay, which is the licensee of the energy, upstream oil and gas energy activity, then this safety net, which is the orphan fund, which is a method of making the remaining companies that still are not bankrupt in the industry, with making them collectively cover those costs, that's a safety net. And that's one way of thinking it. It protects Alberta citizens if it's property management managed from covering certain costs in certain categories, and we'll get into what those categories are. The other ways we might want to think about it is as a big, strong umbrella that protects um, Albertans from the rainy day possibility that these liabilities in certain categories could be, the cost of these liabilities could be borne by them. So the regulator is supposed to build and maintain this really strong umbrella that's supposed to protect all citizens. So what is it that, what are they, what's this umbrella protecting us from? We'll get into that. So the first orphan fund purpose is to protect citizens from bearing closure costs associated with plugging or decommissioning of oil wells, gas wells, water disposal wells, other types of wells that are associated with upstream with extraction of minerals, upstream oil and gas activities. What I've shown here on the right, that's a typical wellhead. That's the top portion of the safety device that maintains pressure in the wellbore, which is really just a hole in the ground, not to be confused with the surrounding site. They're two different things. They're covered by two different laws, and even the regulator had trouble keeping these two very clear matters of law separate, one from the other. So the picture on the right is a pump jack that's still there, and it used to pump oil from a well that's now been abandoned. That wellhead no longer exists here. And if you look carefully, you can see that the wellhead's laying beside the pump jack here, with part of its casing cut off there. So the estimated total liabilities for all wells in Alberta, that's the cost to clean each site up and plug each well, is between 30 and 70 billion dollars. That's the best estimate we have, made by a group called the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project in 2019 or 2018. So these costs would have risen somewhat. The Alberta Auditor General said these costs on the AAR's books are about $66 billion. So, the exact amount isn't that important. It's just an incredible amount of money, and we have to make sure that citizens aren't exposed to these liabilities. On the left, I'm showing a picture of what's called subsurface abandonment. These wells are plugged by a mechanical plug and a bit of cement, usually on top of it, placed down within the well, within the wellbore itself. And on the right, this is a wellhead that's still there. This well hasn't been surface abandoned yet. This is a wellhead of the company named Redwater, that the famous case that went to the Supreme Court. The case is commonly referred to as the Redwater case, which isn't really its correct name, but nevertheless, this is a wellhead of that company. It went broke, and the Orphan Well Association has yet to cut that surface the casing off below ground and get rid of this wellhead. It's probably done by now, since I took this picture several years ago. So I'm showing this a bit on the left. I've chosen to show an oil well here with a pump jack on it. You can see that there's something called surface casing. That's larger pipe that goes down and cemented in, cement up behind the pipe to protect groundwater. And all wells are basically holes in the ground. They can penetrate many different oil or gas bearing formations and they're completed to one of these formations usually. Here we can show that there's some perforations made through the pipe called casing in the well, and this would be the producing reservoir down here at the bottom. There's some strings of pipe in the ground. The production casing is cemented in place. Only the cement behind that pipe prevents the pressure and the oil and or gas from coming up behind the pipe and getting into groundwater or to atmosphere here. On the right, I'm showing an abandoned or plugged well. Here we have the casing cut off and vented just below surface level. The law is 1 meter below for Most wells 2 meters below surface for residential areas. There's a mechanical plug, a cement plug, and that casing gets filled with treated water. And as I said, is vented. There's a cap on it, but it is actually vented to surface below ground. So this cement will age, it will crack, it will leak. The steel will only last for some amount of time, and these wells could leak in future. They say it's a permanent way of sealing these wells, but in reality, we have yet to invent a permanent way of sealing well bores. So liabilities could be for future generations re-entering these hundreds of thousands of wells that we have drilled in the province of Alberta. And up at the right, I've given some figures about how many wells have drilled and how many of these sites, just a low number of them actually have been reclaimed. The well sites have a reclamation certificate so far. The second purpose of the fund would be to protect citizens from closure cost liabilities associated with oil and gas, upstream oil and gas production facilities. This is a picture of a tank battery. It's actually an Orphan. This company has gone broke. All of this facility needs to be removed. There's probably some land contamination here, site cleaned up, etc. I'm estimating these liabilities at 20 to 40 billion. I don't think facility cleanup's ever been properly estimated. The other thing to know is that there are maybe 40,000 licensed facilities in the province, but there's an untold hundreds of thousands of unlicensed facilities at certain wells, sweet oil and gas wells in particular, that have no license. And so no one even knows how many facilities there are out there, let alone be able to estimate the associated cleanup costs. As you can start to see, these costs, potential costs that citizens could have to bear if we don't manage this properly and make the polluter pay, they're enormous. The next category that the Orphan Fund is for, to protect citizens from bearing the cost of pipeline liabilities, or pipelines where there's no viable licensee, the licensee's been orphaned, or the licensee doesn't exist, the pipelines become orphaned. Potential liability here, 20 to 40 billion dollars. Then we have the site cleanups. What I've shown here are a couple of facility sites there and there. These are all well sites here, here, here. They have access roads leading to them. This is a certain area up in northern Alberta and in Fairview, MD of Fairview, Peace River country. The point I want to make is that the site cleanup costs are different from the well plugging costs. Totally different laws. The well can be plugged in a couple of days, a few days, a week at the most. These site cleanups can go on and on for years, even potentially decades. And then the other thing I want to mention is that there are pipeline right-of-ways. These are, somewhat cleaned up at the time the pipeline's built, but they need to be cleaned up as well. They need to be conserved as reclaimed. But the way we deal with pipeline right-of-ways in Alberta, which are interest in land, is very different than well sites and roads. Well sites have annual compensation. This incents in most cases anyway, this incents the operator to clean them up so they can stop paying that compensation. With pipelines, it's different. They must clean them up. They must get a reclamation certificate, but there's no timeline and there's no annual compensation to incent that. So the fact of the matter is that pipeline right-of-ways will probably never be cleaned up in Alberta. The law says you have to clean them up, but doesn't say when. So indefinite delay is contemplated by law, unfortunately, and that is a huge problem. It's a bit of an oversight in how we've managed, particularly annual compensation in the province of Alberta, with the undue influence, I would suggest, of industry. So these costs associated with closure, different types of closure, according to the Alberta Energy Regulator, I've taken this from their website, managed through something called Directive 088. That's that's the main directive for liability management. We'll discuss in part 2. There are these 5 stages of closure. So I'll quickly go through those. The well becomes inactive on stage 1, and at some point in time, they decide, the operator or the Orphan Well Association decides to decommission that well or that facility. That means cutting and capping the wellbore and plugging that wellbore down below, surface abandonment and subsurface abandonment, as I've already shown, uh, remove the wellhead equipment, etc. The third part is what's called an environmental site assessment. So there'll be an assessment done to see if there's any potential contamination of that site caused by disposal of drilling mud on site or spills of substances of concern, etc. If there is contamination on the site, then remediation would occur, and that's why it says if needed. So this means clean up any contaminated soil, remediate any groundwater that's contaminated, etc. If there's groundwater contamination, that can take decades and decades. And then finally, reclaim the land means take the road out, the gravel pads out, take the fencing out, take the cattle guards out, etc. Put topsoil back in or respread it if it's been conserved on site. Maybe plant trees, plant crops, restore the land back to its equivalent land use. One thing that is rarely talked about, equivalent land use could be for residential if it's in a town, could be for industrial use if it's in a town or a county area that is a zone for industrial use. So that's what they mean by equivalent state. A lot of landowners just think that a lot of people think agriculture is the only equivalent state. Far from it. We have public lands that are forest lands all over the province of Alberta. Those lands need to be reclaimed as well. And probably public lands aren't being restored very well. We really don't know. The Alberta Energy Regulator is not very transparent about that. They're the ones that manage public lands as if they were the landowner on behalf of all Albertans. And I suspect they're doing about as good a job as that as they are on everything else that we're going to talk about here today. So history of the Orphan Fund is that in the 1980s and into the 1990s, it occurred to regulators and legislators, governments, that companies could potentially go bankrupt in the future. And so they wanted to start regulating certain things, particularly make these companies post some security, which Danielle Smith this last few days has said they might start doing. And also they wanted to sort of regulate bigger companies that have more money. They want to regulate who they could transfer their well pipeline and facility licenses to, etc. And so industry complained and they said, don't make us put up security deposits. Don't regulate our license transfers. This will impact investment in our industry. So if you let us have a free for all on these 2 points, we will look after any companies in our midst, any of our membership companies that fail. The remaining industry will look after their sites. We'll close their sites. We'll plug their wells. We'll clean up their lands, etc. So we call this liability dumping when you sell your spent and useless wells off to a smaller company. So industries enjoyed this arrangement for more than a quarter of a century, and now it's becoming expensive. Lots of companies are going broke, as we're going to get into in a minute. So now they're starting to say, well, we don't like this arrangement anymore. Well, too bad. It's not unfair to ensure that industry keeps its end of the bargain, especially after they reap the rewards of it for a quarter of a century. So we need to make sure that their obligations are met in full, and we shouldn't feel sorry for them. This is fair. It's what they asked for, and it got encoded into law about the year 2000, and precisely because it's what the industry asked for. And as I said, I think it's much preferable to any other system in the world. It negates the need to have to accurately estimate these liabilities, which I've already shown that can't be done. So as I said from the start, this orphan fund arrangement, if properly managed, is the envy of the world. It's potentially the best system in the world. So let's deal with the closure spending. What's the rate at which these wells are being closed, sites are being cleaned up in terms of dollars spent? So according to the regulator's 2024 liability management report, about a billion per year is being spent currently on closure activities, which means plugging wells and cleaning up sites. 900 million of it by by industry and about 115 million approximately by the Orphan Well Association. So it means that about roughly 10 or 11% of the closure work that's occurring is on so-called orphan wells and well sites. And about 90% is voluntary cleanup. And it isn't necessarily voluntary anymore, as I will come to. So the last thing I want to cover in terms of what closure costs relate to is that um, the activity, meaning a pipeline, a wellbore, or a facility, those are the activities, and the specified land. The specified land is either the well site and access road or the pipeline right of way associated with those activities. That's the land access that's been legally obtained, but some things like spills or even there's a lot of trespass in the industry. So specified land is the land that needs to be certified as reclaimed, that's been used, entered on, or held by the operator legally or illegally. So and then the land cleanup is separate from the decommissioning of the actual activity itself. So what occurs is there's usually a bankruptcy proceeding. Orphan Well Association or some other creditor will trigger bankruptcy proceedings. There will be a trustee appointed, a bankruptcy trustee appointed by the courts. That bankruptcy trustee will wind up the operations of the company, including trying to sell off whatever assets it can. The activities, the wells and pipelines and facilities that are not sold, those are what are normally declared orphans. Well, they should be declared orphans by the regulator. Now, what I've just described isn't necessarily what's required by law. That's how it's done. Okay, I'm not going to get into the legalities of this portion of what I'm talking about. Now, on the right, I've shown how that actually occurs. So closure and environmental protection orders are issued. So the regulator orders the well, facility, or pipeline abandonment. It orders someone to carry that out, and then the regulator issues an environmental protection order. That's for site cleanup and remediation, and orders someone to carry that out for orphan wells. So these orders, closure, and environmental protection orders are carried out either by the working interest participant in the well or the facility. So what that means is there might be some partners, oil companies, two or three or more oil companies may have joined together to share the risks and profits of a well or a facility. If there's still a partner, then that partner will have to clean it up, but they can recover the defunct partner's share from the orphan fund. Or alternately, the AR orders when there's no working interest participant, the licensee is the only person responsible, and they no longer exist because of bankruptcy or they've absconded. Then the Alberta Energy Regulator would order the Orphan Well Association, or OWA for abbreviation, to carry out those closure orders. So finally, under this topic about what is the orphan fund, uh, what costs are and are not covered by the orphan fund or can be covered by the orphan fund by law. So these are matters of law. So on the left, four things can be covered by the fund. First, the closure cost that we've talked about, land remediation, land reclamation, or simply shutting in of wells. If there's a company like recently Alpha Bow not properly operating its wells and broke. So the regulator can order those wells to be shut in. They would order somebody like the Orphan Well Association to do it or someone else, and the cost of those shutdowns that can be borne by the orphan fund. On the right, what's not covered by the orphan fund, in other words, taxpayers or citizens end up paying for it. First, landowner compensation. So where annual compensation is required by law for a well site, a facility site, a related access road. Uh, Even though the company's bankrupt, the landowner is entitled to be compensated under common law principles in Alberta until a reclamation certificate is issued. That reclamation certificate signals the transfer of the use of that land from the operator back to the registered owner. So they're entitled to recover their losses associated with their inability to use that land or any nuisance and inconvenience associated with that until that reclamation certificate is issued. So right now, landowners are filing claims for roughly 30 million per year with the Land and Property Rights Tribunal, who orders the government to pay that landowner. We know that only about a third of landowners know that they can recover these amounts and are filing that. The government's not been very good at advertising that because they don't want to pay for it, presumably. And so there's perhaps been around $150 million estimated by me, very roughly to date, that's been paid out for this, but that is rapidly growing and could be much higher. The second one is municipal taxes. When these sites are still on the landscape, the taxes aren't being paid. It's about 150 million a year or so collectively throughout the province, give or take quite a bit there. That's a rough estimate. I do know that almost $1 billion to date has been written off or is yet to be written off by municipal governments across the province. That's a lot of roads, that's a lot of bridges, that's a lot of county services that ratepayers have to pay for because of these defunct companies. So that pretty much covers the orphan fund and what its purposes are, what the fund can be used for, etc. Part 1B, orphan fund capitalization. How does money get into that fund? And so far we have, I think, about 11,000, maybe 12,000 sites, wells, and facilities designated as orphans that come under the care and custody of the Orphan Well Association. I don't really know the exact number. I've kind of deduced this number from information on the Orphan Well Association website. So the sources of funding permitted by law under the Oil and Gas Conservation Act are two. First of all, the annual orphan fund levy to be determined by the Alberta Energy Regulator. We're going to go through that, how that's done. Each industry member must pay their share of the annual levy. So once a year, the funds are supposed to be put into the orphan fund to be used for the closure of orphan wells, facilities, and pipelines. Second, of borrowing activities. There's been quite a bit of borrowing. The province has lent money to the fund on two occasions, totaling $335 million. The federal government provide a repayable COVID loan in the year 2020, I believe, of $200 million. So that's about $535 million. And the annual levy part of it now goes to repayment of these rather large loans. So those are the sources of funding for the orphan fund permitted by law. There is a growing demand for funds or money from the orphan fund. We're going to deal with that. Part of this I'm going to deal with in the next segment in part 2, but we will deal with it partially here. So this graph here is the last several years, about 8 years or so. It's a graph that comes from the Orphan Well Association's website. For each year, there are 3 bar graphs. So blue on the left, wells still left to decommission and reclaim. So those are mostly new wells that have come in to the care and custody of the Orphan Well Association, in that year that haven't really been dealt with yet. The center green bar sites that need to be reclaimed, and then the smaller darker green bar are sites that have been reclaimed, or the work's been done, if you will. There's monitoring. So They need to be monitored for at least 2 years to make sure vegetation is growing for most agricultural land, etc. So there is a time frame there. So we can see this trend. We have this demand growing. There's more and more orphans all the time each year, and the number of sites to reclaim just keeps growing. Just keeps growing. We're not keeping up with it. And so the backlog of some 8,200 sites, information off the website just a few days ago, 8,200 sites still need to be certified as reclaimed. They've only reclaimed on the bottom line about 3,400 sites to date. So, you know, more than two-thirds of the sites that have become orphaned have not been reclaimed yet. And I'm going to submit, as we'll come to, that that's because of shortages. It's shortages of the orphan well levy is insufficient to get this work done in a timely manner. And as we'll talk about, that's impacting landowners. That's where the costs are being incurred by landowners. So there are about 4,737 wells still to be plugged or abandoned at December 1st of 2025. So the only possible reason for these backlogs, this high inventory of sites that aren't, no work's been done or the work's incomplete, is insufficient funding. So there's about 6,000 plus wells about to come into the Orphan Fund from two companies alone in the short term. Those companies are named Sequoia and Long Run Exploration. So we're probably going to get close to a 50% increase of all the wells that have ever been named orphans. We're going to have this big whack here right away. So the orphan fund levy is going to really need to grow in the years to come, or we're the backlog will be massive, and the cost to taxpayer will be similarly massive. Part 1D, orphan fund illegality. This is the crux of the issue. And as the cartoon shows here, the taxpayer gets it in the end. And that cartoon, the funniest cartoons are usually the ones that sort of hit the truth, hit the nail on the head, if you will. So there's nothing funny about the taxpayer getting stuck for hundreds of billions of dollars in liability, though, I submit. So go back to this umbrella protection metaphor that I've used, what if the regulator were to, instead of building this and maintaining this strong umbrella that protects all citizens from the possibility of liabilities, the flood of liabilities that could happen in case of mass bankruptcy, which are highly possible in the upstream oil and gas industry when the reserves that used to be there in the past just aren't there anymore. What happens when the regulator, the very party that is in charge of building and maintaining this umbrella, actually starts to rip it apart through lack of action or any other means? Well, we'd have today's Alberta. That's the answer. That's what the answer is to what would happen if we ripped apart the safety net or the protection umbrella. So that's what we have to reverse this. We have to make sure that this regulator is strengthening this protection and not weakening this protection. That's the strongest message I can deliver today. So what did we do about this? In the very place where I'm going to be giving this presentation in May of 2025, I was the MC of a press conference. The gentleman in the middle, Mr. Dwight Popovich, and the organization, Coalition for Responsible Energy, or CARE, held a press conference, and we discussed a two-part challenge that we made to these insufficient levy decisions of the regulator. On the right, we have Dr. Norm Campbell, who spoke in that widely covered press release about the human health impacts of orphaned and inactive wells. So this challenge, Popovich et al., the et al. Being members of CARE, we launched a challenge in two parts, and we asked for the Alberta Energy Regulator to review its own decisions, to have its hearing commissioners through quasi-judicial hearings or proceedings or inquiries to review and vary their recent annual orphan fund levy decisions. The one request, application ID 1958245, was for what's called regulatory appeal. You can ask for a decision within a certain many days after that decision is made to be reviewed by hearing commissioners if the decision was made without a hearing. The other review procedure that can be requested under the enabling statute of the Alberta Energy Regulator is called reconsideration, where any decision made by the regulator can be reconsidered, and I submit should be reconsidered if, as here, it potentially displays errors of law or jurisdiction. So we requested these reviews on two grounds, which I've put at the bottom. So the first was that there are mandatory factors, three of them, we're going to come to them in a minute, that must be observed in setting the levy each year that industry must pay into the Orphan Fund. And then it's clear, crystal clear at law that the Alberta Energy Regulator is supposed to make this decision according to the law set out in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, not with input from the government or anyone else. But we allege that the Alberta Energy Regulator didn't follow either one of these provisions, and therefore there was two errors of law in each one of these orphan levy decisions for the last 5 years. So we asked for those to be reviewed. What occurred is that on November 18th, 2025, perhaps not surprisingly, definitely alarmingly, the Alberta Energy Regulator dismissed, more or less arbitrarily dismissed, the challenges filed by Popovich et al. So what we really know now, after these challenges were filed, and despite all the media coverage that we got, the regulator really has no interest in properly capitalizing the Orphan Fund as it's required to do by law. We have a runaway regulator. It's as simple as that. Now, anybody who wants to find this, this is the application find tool I've put on the right on the Alberta Energy Regulator's website. You can put that application number into this tool, and you can view all the submissions on these attachments, or you can view the reasoning of the regulator, why it dismissed these requests by using this tool. And I'm not going to get into those issues too much, probably partly because there will almost certainly be future litigation at the courts on this matter. We have to make sure this levy amount is properly levied. The appropriate amount by law is levied, or citizens will end up with these billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of liabilities dropped in their lap at some date in the future. We can prevent it. So this graph is from the Alberta Energy Regulator's website. It shows the insufficient levies that they've asked industry to pay as a whole. This is the money that's gone into the Orphan Fund since 2009. The most recent decision for 2025 is not shown in the graph, but it was 145.45 million, the highest amount ever, which is still grossly insufficient. So those are the amounts that have been levied to date. This graph is also from the regulator's website. What it's showing is the Orphan Well Association's estimate of the costs left, that cost going to be required to retire its large inventory of wells, facilities, pipelines, sites, to close them, to reclaim the sites, to clean up the spills, etc. And the latest estimate at the time the 145.45 million levy decision was made was a $862 million shortfall. Now, that amount has been increased by the Orphan Well Association since then, and is currently on their books estimated at $1.2 billion. Now, that's an important amount to remember, the shortfall, because of it's one of the factors that the regulator is supposed to consider in setting the levy, which is what we'll get into, what we'll get into next. So the orphan fund legislation that governs all these things, what the fund's used for, how the levy is supposed to be calculated, etc., all set out in Part 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, which I'm going to abbreviate as the OGCA. And this is the statute that is administered by the Alberta Energy Regulator, that allows for the licensing or the oil and gas wells and facilities in the province of Alberta. Licensing means that when you get a license, you can conduct an otherwise illegal activity, which was confirmed by the Supreme Court in this famous Redwater case that I mentioned. So this is the start of the orphan fund legislation, which has that title right there in the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. So by law, orphan fund legislation must be administered solely by the Alberta Energy Regulator. Under Section 94 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, the Alberta Energy Regulator has exclusive jurisdiction or authority to carry out the statutory tasks, and those tasks are to determine the quantum of the annual orphan fund levy according to 3 mandatory factors that are legislated, and B, to make a rule that sets out who must pay the levy, when that levy must be paid by, etc. So making a rule like this is called an exercise of delegated legislative authority. And the way that works is that the often parliaments or legislatures, like the Alberta Legislative Assembly, would deem someone like a regulator to have more expertise than lawmakers. And so they say, we have the only lawmaking power, and we will delegate specific aspects of our powers to you. You can make a rule setting out these things that I've shown here in item 1B. And so that's now, under administrative law, nobody administrative, the premier, ministers, regulators, etc., they don't have unlimited powers. They only have the powers given to them by statute. And the statute only gives the power to administer the orphan levy and the whole orphan fund and set the levy. Well, then no one else can do it. It's really a simple, straightforward matter of law. So that's what the orphan fund legislation does under Section 73. That's what we're going to look at. That's the section that dictates how the levy is to be determined and how what rules can be made to force industry to pay that levy. But before we get into that, I want to show, got some excerpts from the Alberta Energy Regulator's website here, where they actually make statements on the orphan fund levy that are absolute proof, unless, their lawyers say, oh, well, the regulator can make mistakes on its website. Well, I don't know. Right here it says that, so it confirms what I've just told you under Section 73 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. They are as authorized to prescribe the orphan fund levy for each fiscal year. Then it goes about explaining how they do that. And here it says that the regulator recommends the orphan fund levy amount to the government of Alberta for the government's approval. Well, that's not contemplated by law. That's breaking the law, literally. And they say that the recommended amount supports a reduction of orphan liabilities over time. And it says that the regulator uses information about the current volume of the orphan inventory, the volume of potential sites that might be orphans, the average site closure rate of the Orphan Well Association to inform their recommendation. Well, these aren't factors. These aren't the factors that are required under Part 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act. There are some mandatory factors that have to be considered, and these aren't them. This is all law breaking. This is all the AR and the government off doing their own thing without the powers to do so, contrary to law. So it says once the government approves the recommended levy amount, we issue. So the government's making the decision. They have no power to do that. Their decision is, you know, would be ultra vires. They don't have the power to do that. It says that the once the government makes the decision, the regulator issues the levy to energy companies, and the funds received are transferred to the Orphan Well Association's budget. And then it says the levy helps prevent closure costs from being passed on to Albertans. Fair enough, but it's quite clear if you read the law that, and as I've already said, the orphan levy is so supposed to absolutely prevent, not just help prevent closure costs from being passed on. It's supposed to make sure no closure costs are passed on to Albertans. So we can see here evidence on the AR's own website that it doesn't know how to interpret its laws, or it certainly doesn't know how to administer these laws, which we've entrusted it to do. So if it's not doing what's entrusted to do, well, we have a big problem. It's just like it's equivalent of the police not arresting bank robbers or murderers. If that happened, there'd be a pretty big outcry. But if the energy regulator doesn't do what it's supposed to do in Alberta, oh, that's all okay. That's all okay somehow. So let's talk about the two subsections that comprise Section 73 of the OGCA, which we saw that the regulator has confirmed, is the relevant section of the law. So this one's called Orphan Fund Levy, both subsections. And this one says using permissive language. The word may is permissive. It means it doesn't have to be done. It grants discretion to the regulator. So it says if the regulator wants to, in other words, in respect of each fiscal year, it can, by rules, those are the key words, and those are the wording used to dismiss CARES challenges. Prescribe these three things. That's the classes of wells and facilities other than pipelines and unreclaimed sites, and the rates of the orphan fund levy applicable to each class, the date of which these licensees of these various sites must pay their portion of the orphan fund levy, etc. And so you can make rules saying, okay, this is how we're going to order industry to pay, each industry member to pay its share of the levy. Okay, so these rules, in other words, this rule doesn't apply at all to determining the quantum of the orphan fund, which is done in subsection 2. So let's take a look at that next. That's the next subsection. So it says right here at the top, in prescribing the orphan fund levy for a fiscal year, the regulator shall. That's an imperative word. It means they have no choice. They have to do what's listed here. And so it says shall provide for a total levy that will be sufficient. That's the key words to cover A, B, and C. So the first one is the cost referred to. Those are the closure costs we went over in part 1A of my presentation. So it has to be sufficient to cover all those estimated closure costs. B, any deficiency arising out of the fund from the previous year. Well, that at the time the last levy decision was made was the $862 million shortfall. And then any surplus, any contingency for emergency, etc. So considering these, well, if the estimated costs are 145.45 million, and there's a shortfall, well, it's about roughly $1 billion that's required to be levied here. But we're well short, and we're falling further and further all the time, and the inventory is going up all the time. We can see what's happening here. So instead of doing what's required by law here, it simply went to the government and said, well, we cleaned up so many wells last year. We could probably do a few more. So, it was 135 million. Let's raise it by 10 million. And this is like asking the murderer, because the Orphan Well Association is run by industry. It's like asking the murderer, how long do you think your sentence ought to be? Of course, he's going to say 6 months. or none or house arrest. You're not going to say life imprisonment. I think I've made my point. So I just want to make one other point here. I've included this slide. It's a little bit of this picture, photograph. It's the cover of a magazine. It's a picture of someone named Susan Riddell Rose. She sold a company for $10 or so that had some 4,200 worthless wells to a company named Sequoia, who went bankrupt 18 months later. Almost all of those wells eventually made their way into the orphan well program. The bankruptcy trustee sued her, PricewaterhouseCoopers sued her, and they settled it for 25 million. So she kicked in an extra 25 million towards the closure cost for those wells, which probably won't go anywhere near close to closing them all. And for all that, she was awarded an industry lifetime achievement award. So if you dump your liabilities onto others and they get dumped onto your fellow industry members who don't want to pay, and that can all get dumped onto the citizens of Alberta, potentially in the future, well, you're a real hero in downtown Calgary, which I submit is, is a town where its business community is got a little bit off the rails. So anyway, I just want to point that out. We've got a serious problem in downtown Calgary with this oil executives and the regulators that are supposed to regulate this industry because they've just run amok of the law. The rule of law means nothing to them. Part two, liability management. As I said, I'm only going to briefly cover this subject. It's fairly complex. This is a matter between industry and government. Liability management, unlike the Orphan Fund, the purpose is to make sure that the correct industry member pays for its own closure costs. The Orphan Fund, something very different. It's going to make sure the citizen never pays by making industry as a whole responsible, because that's what these licensees asked for in the past. So, but they're both measures of citizen protection. So, like I said, there's two layers. Excuse me, if liability management doesn't work, we have to make sure the Orphan Fund is the catch-all. So total estimated liabilities. This is a graph made by the former vice president of closure at the Alberta Energy Regulator. Please ignore the mining. I'll talk to it briefly. Mining means oil sands, tar sands, tailing ponds, etc. up north. The Orphan Fund does not pertain to that at all. The Orphan Fund only pertains to the stuff shown in the bottom. That's wells, facilities, and pipelines. And the total estimate for wells, facility, pipelines here is $130 billion. Only $1.6 billion for both categories, oil sands and wells and facilities and pipelines, ever been collected. And that's only about 1 or 2%, 2.5% at the most ever of the total outstanding liabilities has ever been collected in security deposits. So when it comes to upstream conventional oil and gas, unless we do this Orphan Fund levy properly, those costs are going to end up in taxpayers' labs. So the old liability management system was put in place in the year 2000. It's now being phased out. Phase out started in around 2020. Totally unacceptably, scandalously, the AR has its foot still half in the old management system, the other half in the new management system. Nobody can determine for sure what it's doing. You can't challenge any of these decisions. It's the only way to describe it is just an absolutely abysmal mess. So this old system was based on several directives, 001, 006, 011, 067, etc. And it was based on something called a liability management ratio. So they calculated a ratio for every company that held licenses. And it was deemed liabilities compared to deemed assets. Deemed, they weren't looking at the financial statements in the past. They just had these strange ways of calculating these liabilities and assets. So the whole intent was to try to this ratio would predict or indicate somehow how solvent each company was. So if your LMR ratio was over one, you're deemed to be solvent. You didn't have to put up any security, et cetera, et cetera. If you had an LMR of one, your assets were equal to your liabilities. So, okay, you could cover things off if you went broke. But if your LMR is less than one, then all of a sudden you don't have enough assets to cover your liabilities, and then security deposits would be required, or you'd have to abandon a few wells to bring your LMR up to one, etc. And so the problem with this system is that companies with LMR over one went bankrupt. The system was found not to be working, and then therefore it got changed. So we're gonna there are still some figures from the old LMR system that we're going to look at as we go through this, because I still have to, as I said in the part one, the growing demand, how many, the fact that there's going to be more and more and more orphans is absolutely crystal clear from the records of the AR related to this uh, somewhat defunct LMR system that's sort of still half in use. So, let's get into now what the new liability management framework is. So the new liability management framework started to be brought in around 2020. Is based on a new Directive 088 and Manual 23. The Directive 6, at least, has been completely rescinded for the old system. Some of the other directives are still in play. It grants a lot more discretionary powers to the AR on how to manage these things, and is largely based on what's called a holistic approach, which is uh, component number two. So the new framework is said to be comprised of six components, which I've shown here. And we're going to go through all six of them. Most of them are nothing burgers, several of them are nothing burgers. So we're going to spend time on only really a couple of them, and even then only briefly. So the problem with this is that under the old system, you could determine through LMR whether or not security deposits should be collected or not, and you could challenge if the regulator didn't do it. You could challenge their decisions, for example, to transfer certain well licenses or something like that. Under the new system, there's so much discretion given to the regulator that it's not possible to say that errors were made. And so there's this holistic approach, but it's totally opaque. Nobody really knows what's going on. But the measure of whether there's two measures: how many wells are getting closed and what the security deposits are compared to the liabilities. And if we deal with those, we can still see that there's really, under the new approach, nothing's really changed, except perhaps some changes under the first category, which is called mandatory spend target. So let's deal with that. We'll go through these six components of the new liability management framework as quickly as possible. First is mandatory industry-wide closed spend. So it was introduced in 2022. The regulator says, well, the industry must spend 422 million on closure of wells, facilities, and cleanup of the related sites. And the amount's been increased to 700 million, was 750 million for last year, and expected to remain at 750 million for 2026. Sounds great. We're now attacking the problem of these inactive wells. Some of them needs to be closed. The problem here is they usually spend it on well plugging, not on site cleanup. That way we're still paying the landowner payments still have to be made. And if we go at this pace, it'll take about a century, a little longer, to close all these sites. Most of these companies won't be around in 10 or 15 years, let alone 100 years. And if there's nobody paying into the orphan fund, well, I think you know who's going to pay. The taxpayer always gets it in the end, right? Right. So corporate health. Corporate health is how this is the holistic approach they're supposed to be taking. So they do have to submit financials now under Directive 067 instead of estimating assets and liabilities as they did before, which didn't work at all. And so these figures that I'm giving here, they're from the February 1st, 2025 LMR report. Now, they used to put these LMR reports out monthly for all for the industry, and the last time they did it is February 1st, 2025, and this is some of the figures that were there. And from this, we can see that there's about 671 companies that hold licenses. Here are they hold 345,000 approvals. That's well licenses, facility licenses, and pipeline licenses. They're deemed assets. Well, that's a big number. $161 billion. Their liabilities, $30 billion. That's a low number. If it's 130, like the VP estimated, well, the whole industry is almost insolvent if you properly calculate these liabilities. Total estimated liability is about 30 billion. Security held 322 million. That's again 1%. So that's the nature of the problem. We're not getting anywhere. Here, there are thousands of effective orphans on the books. This report, the last LMR report. I've drawn the red line in. That's where the one ratio comes in. So above that red line, these companies are deemed to be insolvent. Their assets don't cover their closure costs. And those ones below the red line, they are deemed to still be solvent. So we can see here that the ones that have LMR of 0, that means they're basically totally broke. There's 216 of those companies, so a good third of the industry has no money whatsoever. They hold 13,000 licenses. Their total assets are $89,000 divided by 216 companies. That's not much money left for each company. That's not enough to close even one well of each licensee, let alone all these 12,000, 13,000 here. That's a real problem. Those companies' assets, those companies, they're not even operating. They don't have offices. They don't have employees. Their wells aren't being checked. There's 12,000 activities out there that are dangerous, that are being looked after by no one, and yet they're not orphans yet. What's wrong with this picture? So all of these, most of these wells, whatever, some of these will get sold, but these companies will go broke. The odd good well will get sold off, but the vast majority are going to be orphans. What do we have? Big potential orphan well problem, unless we get that levy up, unless we start calculating that levy properly and closing these things off while we still have companies to pay into the orphan fund. Unless we do that, we've got this massive problem coming at us like a tsunami, and we can either tear down the orphan well fund protections, allow the regulator to tear them to parts, whereby we have to pay, or we can insist that they be maintained and strengthened, where we'll be shielded from these liabilities. The choice is yours. The choice is yours to make. Support for struggling operators is the third component. There's no information on it. We don't even know. I guess they give them a little advice or something at the regulator. I don't know. Don't know. It's a nothing burger. Moving on. Site closure nominations. Since about 2022, there's been rule changes, regulation changes, whereby if the site on your land is being inactive, for 5 years or more, you can nominate it for closure. You can file a nomination form with the regulator. There's no guarantee that the regulator will force closure of that site. There's not much new information on this feature of liability management. It's a positive change for sure, but most landowners are still getting paid or can get paid by the taxpayer. Lots of landowners would prefer to have the money come in instead of, the alternative. Couldn't be bothered to file the nomination form, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who knows? So while it's a positive development, I would not classify this as one that has any significant value, especially for general taxpayers, general citizens. Fifth one is a legacy well panel that's supposed to be established. Well, I went to 6 days of liability management government sessions in the year 2017. That's been 8 years ago. We talked about the need to deal with legacy orphan wells back then. Not one thing's been done. I think there might be a panel now, but there's no landowners on it. There's no members of the public on it. Industry will continue to advise the government what to do about this problem because, and probably very little will be done because they don't have to pay for it. So uh, I think here something's probably going to be done at some point in time. We don't know what. Expectations that I have are pretty low for this particular feature. And then the final one is some expanded Orphan Well Association powers. Um, the Orphan Well Association can trigger bankruptcies. They have extra powers to do that now. They can shut in wells of companies like Alphabo, which is a Sequoia company. If the company is insolvent and regulatory non-compliant, like Alphabo, the regulator might decide that it's unsafe for them to have several thousand wells that are not being properly operated, order the Orphan Well Association to shut them down, pending bankruptcy proceedings, etc. And the cost of those shutdowns would come out of the Orphan Fund. Now, these new and additional powers uh, have been, with great respect to legal academics that have written papers on liability management, these are the only powers of the OWA that fall under the category of liability management. The Orphan Fund is not part of liability management, contrary to what they've written in their papers. So the Orphan Fund is legislated, it's separate. It's got mandatory aspects to it where liability management is different. The regulator can do what it wants, I suppose. Government's definitely interfering there. But so anyway, those are two separate things. As I've explained, the Orphan Fund is the catch-all, the safety net, the umbrella, etc., to save us in the event liability management is not fully protecting citizens for any reason whatsoever. So that pretty much sums up the liability management, or part two. Let's get into part three. It's brief. We're almost done here. Legislation changes that I recommend: how to achieve full polluter pay. So these would be changes that would have to be, some MLA would have to propose these. There'd have to, or government would have to propose them. There would have to be bills, votes in the legislature, etc., to bring about these changes. The two changes I recommend are to amend existing law so that payments to landowners, which are occurring for decades until reclamation certificates are issued, payments for losses associated with orphan wells that are in the care and custody of the Orphan Well Association. We should amend the law so that those payments come from the Orphan Fund, so that they're covered by industry and not covered by taxpayers. That's the second one, is to do the same thing for municipal taxes, that municipalities get paid from the Orphan Fund on behalf of delinquent companies and on behalf of orphan sites until they're closed. This would all mean that delay is now going to cost the industry money, not taxpayers. And so industry would be further incentive to get these things done, to pay up under the Orphan Well Fund, get these sites properly closed in a reasonable period of time. That would all improve the health and safety out there, get these things off the landscape, reduce the amount of liability that citizens would be potentially liable for in case these companies all fail and leave us with orphans in our lap, that sort of thing. So there would need to be changes to the Surface Rights Act and the Oil and Gas Conservation Act to accomplish number one, and there would need to be changes to the Municipal Government Act and the Oil and Gas Conservation Act to accomplish the second one. There's some other law changes we could do. We could tighten up the wording of how we, the wording in Part 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act about how the levy is supposed to be decided and by whom, because clearly the AR's interpretation is in industry's favor and not in citizens' interests. Those are some other changes we could do, but these are the ones that would It would increase polluter pay, if you will. So we're done. You'll wrap up some conclusions here. First conclusion, the Orphan Fund is the critical central means in Alberta of ensuring closure costs are never borne by the public. We could increase what this Orphan Fund covers, as I just said, to give more polluter pay protection to the citizens of Alberta. Number three, we absolutely must ensure the Orphan Fund levy is properly determined, even if that requires changes to the law to make sure, and that changes could mean that someone besides the law now allows for someone besides the Alberta Energy Regulator to determine the levy. So if the regulator can't do it, cabinet can order someone else to do it, and someone else could clearly do this with the oversight of the courts. It's not difficult. The three factors are there. So we have to make sure, citizens have to make sure through pressure on their elected officials that this orphan fund levy is properly determined. And finally, voting citizens must either reject weakening of the polluter pay principle, uh, example through by way of this mature asset strategy possibly, or citizens must agree to pay some portion or all of industry's cleanup bills, because right now citizens haven't agreed. And the orphan fund's supposed to be protecting you, but the government isn't following the law, and more importantly, the regulator isn't following the law. What we need, if there's one message I can leave you with, in Alberta, we desperately need a return to the rule of law in all matters of oil and gas, including setting this critical orphan fund levy. And if we don't, the cost is going to be borne by citizens. For everything oil sands and upstream oil and gas, it's about $50,000 per every man, woman, and child in the province, and about $25,000 for if we don't fund the orphan levy properly. It's about $25,000 potential for every man, woman, and child in the province. I say write your check or stand up for protection of the polluter pay principle. Thanks for watching.